Finland seems extremely kind of clean in a way and very functional in the way things are organized, where people would fix things way before they become broken. That is a very uncommon thing in the rest of the world, I think, in general. Yeah, I did grow up in a family where my parents speak Russian as their native language, but say my mother comes from a Russian-speaking family, but my dad comes from Ukrainian-speaking family.
Yeah.
Even if you look at like old Soviet posters, you would see that they like to represent all different republics as like people dressed up in their national costumes, but somehow the guy representing Russia was always wearing a suit. And it's like, I'm the white person here and all of you guys are just like natives. We, kind of conquered. So like there was this like clear kind of understanding in society that you have to speak Russian. So what will happen if Ukraine gets defeated? Ukrainian people will be conscripted, sent to invade Poland, Lithuania, or maybe even Finland. We don't know. Whatever Russia decides to invade next, Kazakhstan.
Hi, this interview will be in English because Artur moved out of Finland already 9 years ago. So, yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. But I think there will be interesting things to talk about. Artur has lived in a few different places, so I think we will hear some interesting insight and maybe some useful ideas for people who have just arrived here or are planning to come here to Finland. So yeah, do you want to tell a little bit about yourself? Where do you come from? Where are you heading to? Or
yes. So originally born and raised in Ukraine. I lived there for most of my life until about 10 years ago, give or take. And then I moved to Finland, to Helsinki, because I had a job offer from the company I was working for. And I lived in Finland for 2 years in Helsinki, here in the city. Yeah. And then I moved to Boston, to the United States, and then I moved to San Francisco. So basically, out of the last 10 years, for 2 years I lived in Helsinki, and for 8 years I lived in the United States.
Yeah. So how was it living in Finland? What kind of observations did you make about the culture and maybe the work environment?
It definitely was interesting, and I think it was really great that I moved to Finland first and then to the States, because otherwise I would not have experienced all the interesting quirks of life in Finland. First of all, it did feel very familiar and similar, I think, especially then going kind of backwards, back in the future, comparing it to the United States. Finland is a European country and everything feels European. There are cities, there is trams, there is public transit in general, there is grocery stores, things are open till late in many places, and so in a way that was very familiar to me coming from Ukraine versus you go to the United States and in a lot of places you only can drive. Things close early, like bars in San Francisco close at 2 a.m. Even though I'm not drinking, that is still strange. I'm used to there is something that's open until much later. Yeah, it felt like a kind of a smooth transition in a way. What was different? What was different is that Finland seems extremely kind of clean in a way and very functional in the way things are organized, where people would fix things way before they become broken. That is a very uncommon thing in the rest of the world, I think, in general. It's like usually people only start thinking about maybe we should fix this thing after it completely collapsed, versus here it's like, well, this thing is going to be broken like 50 years from now, let's start fixing it. So much more long-term planning, I think that's definitely what I've noticed. And in terms of work culture, definitely very serious separation of personal life and work life. So say coming from Ukraine, working for American company, that was my previous experience before coming to Finland, I felt like, there was no strict hours per day. There was no such thing as like, overtime. You were just like working as much as needed to deliver what you promised. Sometimes you would not work that much, sometimes you would work a lot. Overall, it will even out, but there was no kind of stability in the number of hours I would work per day. Versus in Finland, I quickly realized that the way people at work were looking at it was just, well, I'm here from this hour till this hour, and I'm not here like outside of those hours. I'm not going to be on call. I'm not just going to be, working from home, whatever, right? It's just that people really value their personal life here, and that was a really interesting lesson that I kind of brought with myself to the United States, and I kind of started spreading this virus of like, hey, we should probably not just grind ourselves into oblivion by just working overtime all the time. Let's just value our personal time and actually demand that it will be valued.
Yeah, I guess we have this philosophy that well planned is half done.
Yeah.
So maybe that helps. Hobbies and free time are valued in Finland, I guess, more than in many other countries. And yeah, if you are well rested, you'll probably work more efficiently. Also, in many cases, at least. Yeah. But yeah, there are Finns who work 12 hours per day also. And yeah, I guess sometimes it can work, and some people really love what they do, so they have more fun working than in hobbies and free time. But yeah, but I guess it's also a little dangerous. Like, what if you're not able to work anymore? Like, you don't have anything in your life, possibly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, everybody decides for themselves. I think it's good to have some freedom in this respect. And I did like that there was some kind of separation between personal and work life. You close your laptop, you don't care about anything. Well, again, as you said, it depends on the situation. I mean, working on a startup myself, that's just impossible. You cannot just like abandon the startup and say like, well, I just don't care about it. You can do this in a bigger company. You cannot do it in a small project.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this startup is actually very interesting. And so, what are you creating with your project and startup?
Yeah, what I'm trying to do is to make a platform that would help people to learn the skills of critical thinking, metacognition, debating, communication, and use it when discussing or debating things online, which I think is a really needed thing these days when we go online and people try to have conversations, arguments about all sorts of things. And well, they just don't go that well. I think there is a lot of noise, there is not enough signal in public conversations. So we're trying to improve this with this startup. I think the backbone of like what we're hoping to affect is just to help people to find mutual understanding when they're having, let's say, polarizing conversations that divide people. It's not about agreement as much as it is about mutual understanding and understanding where are your boundaries in this debate, where are other people's boundaries in the debate. What are the arguments, what are you sure about, what you're not sure about. So basically, bringing more of like a debating culture into the society.
Yeah. Yeah, we can have some screenshots about the prototype of this website, and I think it's quite unique. Like, if you compare it to many other, or maybe all of the other social media websites, it's quite a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad you are confirming our hypothesis that it's hopefully gonna work, and also thanks for helping with Finnish translation.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, and I've been writing a few articles there also, and I've enjoyed the experience, and it's nice that the comments are directed towards the individual phrases. So it really helps to keep the conversation on point, or how would you express it? So yeah,
I think it maintains the context better.
Yeah,
because like you're debating specifically this sentence or that sentence and not something as a whole.
You have quite a lot of experience about learning languages also. What advice would you give to someone starting to learn a new language or wanting to take their foreign language to a really high level so you're able to actually use it and have conversations in it?
I think my advice would be to use as many different or distant tools as possible. Usually what helped me to learn languages, for example, when I learned Spanish, back in Ukraine in Kiev, actually I was learning Spanish just because I wanted to learn one more language after English. And I thought, well, there should be a language that is really popular in the world and relatively easy for somebody who speaks language that I speak. And I did figure out that Spanish was probably that language. It came out, very useful. I did realize that Spanish is indeed not that difficult to learn compared to Finnish, and also that it is very much used by people all around the world. So how did I start? I started with several different things. It was Michelle Thomas audio lessons. It was Duolingo. It was just like some online free, very basic things. Like there's a website that was, I think, teaching some basic grammar, etc. Then I went to the language classes in person in Kiev, and I would just do all those things at the same time. I would try to watch some YouTube videos in basic Spanish. You cannot just rely on one tool and keep going. Like, I think there's a lot of people who think they can learn language just by using Duolingo, for example, and never interacting with this language in any other way. I'm not sure that's even possible, but I would definitely recommend using it as one of the tools, right? So you have to integrate, I think, learning experience from several different channels as a beginner. And then eventually to actually start kind of getting more advanced, to become more fluent, you will actually need to have some conversations with either native speakers or other people who are learning the language. And you should not postpone it. You should actually start doing it as early as possible. And I know it's awkward, it's weird, it feels like you don't know a word, it feels like you're like 2 years old, because like you probably, whatever you're saying is super dumb compared to what you can express in your native language. That's all, part of the learning process. You just have to go through it. And the more you talk, the more you interact, the more you practice, the better you become, very slowly. Like you go into the gym, it's kind of similar dynamics. It's like there will be plateaus. There will be topics in a language which are like verb conjugations in Spanish. I think I haven't really mastered them even still. I just try to avoid them by using like a simpler verb forms, etc. But just find your ways. Find a way to be expressive in this new language.
Yeah, I think often people forget that you can kind of explain something in a different way, even if you don't know the perfect verb conjugation. You can still explain it, and being understood is the main thing when you're communicating. And I think that's the fun part, also interacting with native speakers. And you also, over time, you learn how to learn. And
it becomes easier. Like after the first language, the second comes easier, I think, and so on.
And I mean, you were able to have at least some kind of conversations in Finland in Finnish when you were living here. And what would be your advice, maybe specifically for Finnish? How did you get to this level of being able to communicate?
Well, first of all, I think I want to point out that for anyone who learns Finnish, you actually have to learn like 3 languages instead of 1, because there is kirja kieli, the official language, that is something that you read when you read news or you listen to the president of Finland speaking. But what people speak on the streets is more of a puhe kieli, which is spoken language, which sounds very different for somebody who doesn't know the language, right? I don't know, if somebody asks you for a check at the grocery store, kuiti, well, you don't say entarvitse, you say entarvi. You just throw away the last part of the word. You don't say minä or sinä, you say mä or sa, something like that. You don't say, I don't know, even if it's subway station, sornenen, people just call it sorka. And if you haven't heard this name, you have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And also there is also Helsingin slangi, the local version of the slang where, I don't know, the ratika, the tram, is called also spora, right?
Yeah,
Which
the
is
Swedish
yeah.
influence. Yeah, yeah.
which is just like this random word that's got into slang that is spoken by people in Helsinki. And
Yeah.
so you have to basically learn more than one language, and that's, I think, that was my biggest struggle, because I would go to the language classes at Helsingin yliopisto at university, and I would be taught the kirjakieli, and I would come home and I would read news in Finnish, and I would understand everything in the news. I would be like, well, I can read Yle, I know Finnish. I go to the street and I cannot understand the word that people is talking about. Mostly because also because people use a lot of the grammar is not that different. There is slight difference in grammar in spoken Finnish, but it's not crazy different. I think we've been attacked by a seagull or something.
Okay.
And but still people are using words in a different manner, so it just does. I mean, any language really has spoken and written variety, but I think in Finnish this distance is far enough apart that it feels like two different languages for newcomers, like a dialect of a language. And the challenge, I think, was that I would go to the university and I would be taught that language. I would not be taught the other language completely. Sometimes, you know, the teacher would mention, oh, it's also like this in spoken language, but it was not the priority. And I feel like that was a gap, because without knowing the spoken language, I couldn't start interacting with people and speaking to them and understand them, or like even like hear the conversation and plug into the conversation. I had to always switch to this default language, and people would have to also switch to this like very official sounding language. So I think that was the biggest challenge, and I would think that the best way to overcome it is to somehow find a way to plug into this spoken language and find somebody who can help you with like catching up there as quickly as possible.
Yeah, yeah. On my channel I have some videos where I teach kind of natural Helsinki area spoken language, or at least having some elements of spoken language. I mean, often also Finnish people, they will adjust their language at least a little bit to make it more standard. So I guess that will help.
It did help, but I must also point out that a lot of people in Finland, I felt like they want to practice their English as much as they want to practice my Finnish, and their English was already more advanced than my Finnish, so it was an obvious kind of direction where like, oh, let's just switch to English. Like a lot of people do switch to English in Finland when you try to speak broken Finnish, because I think also because they're trying to be polite and nice. They're like, you don't have to like torture yourself by learning this really complicated language. It's fine, we'll just speak English. So they're trying to be nice to me, but also they're preventing me from learning the language.
Yeah, I guess some Finns may believe that it's impossible. Hello, seagull.
Hello.
It's impossible for someone to learn Finnish as an adult, which is not true, as you probably agree. But there's conversation going on in the Finnish society that we should challenge foreigners to use their Finnish a bit more. So maybe starting the conversations in Finnish, and these days I ask, do you want to speak Finnish or English quite often?
I have to also say that I worked in a company where English was the main language, right? So like even at work, I didn't have to use Finnish. And I think that is a big difference between me and somebody who comes to work and they're surrounded by Finnish-speaking people. And yes, somebody can speak English to them, but mostly everything is in Finnish. And so I'm sure I would have been much better at Finnish if I was required to speak Finnish at my work, and like if I could catch up over time. If somebody would say, it's fine that you can't come here at level like A.5, right? But we want you to be at level, I don't know, B1 in a year or B2 or whatever, you know, and I'll be like, totally, I really want to do this. Because I think that's the problem, where the jobs would either require you to come here at like and work at like C1, right? Like it should be like at least moderate fluency in Finnish, and for that you just cannot work. or you go and that's just English-speaking environment or something where the language is not that important, and so you don't have that much opportunity to catch up on the language. I think it would be great if workplaces had this thing where like we can hire you even if you don't speak Finnish, but we will help you to get to proficient level.
Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe one more question about the language. Like, what's your advice on how to make language learning any language more fun?
No, that's a good question. I think doing things that you think or feel are fun in that other language, and that will make those things much less fun at first. For example, one of the ways for me to learn Spanish was to watch movies in Spanish, not just translated, because I don't need to hear somebody translating English into Spanish. It was movies which were like Mexican movies, for example, or Spanish movies originally. So I would see people actually using native phrases, terminology, gestures, whatever. And yes, that was tough at first because I was like, I'm not really enjoying watching this movie. I'm actually stopping it every once in a while and trying to read this word, trying to guess what it means, then seeing it in the dictionary and actually means a completely different thing. I need to go back. So it makes watching a movie much less fun experience, but it's still not awful. You can still tolerate it if your goal is to learn the language. And eventually...
Better than textbook.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I've never really enjoyed textbooks that much. Yeah. So things like that. Or I would... Actually, my phone is switched to Spanish right now. And it was in Finland, it was in Finnish. And my computer is switched to Spanish. So like you just switch your user interface. And then, you actually have to look up every button you press in the dictionary, because if you don't, you have no idea what you're doing. Yeah. And at first it is frustrating, it slows you down, but once your user interface is in that different language, somehow it keeps it always in your brain, so you don't lose the skills that you have achieved. Like your brain is always like, oh, I still need this language, I still need to remember that language.
Yeah, I think iOS, for example, at least it has quite many phrases also in that language. So I think it's not, as you know, it's not only the buttons like one individual words, but there are also like warnings and explanations.
Yeah, also as somebody who likes reading in general, I would just read Yle news, for example, just to see what are the news in Finland, what's going on. And Yle has a simplified English, not simplified English, but simplified Finnish version of the website. So that was really good in teaching me some basic, official Finnish.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to build up vocabulary. I personally love learning languages with comics because there's a lot of dialogue, and often you'll find expressions that they use a lot in daily life, and not many descriptions of nature and landscape, and those may be useful if you're trying to reach higher levels of the language.
Exactly. I think one of the lesser known, Finnish comics that I really liked is Kamala Luonto. It's about animals in the forest doing all sorts of disgusting and strange things. And yes, most of the words they say are or something like that, but some of the words they say are actual Finnish language, and that was really interesting to learn. And there were some jokes, there were some word jokes that are hard to grasp, but eventually you get there, and it's fun to figure out what is funny about this picture. Also, I would have to mention Fingerpori. Fingerpori is very interesting. It is quite advanced, I think, because it often plays on kind of some things that are just not just language based, but also cultural, right? Like you need to there are some cultural references, or there is some pun that it's not easy to get, but once you get it, you're like, wow, I really know some Finnish.
Then I think it would be interesting to talk about Ukraine. Artur grew up in a Russian-speaking family, or at least in large part.
Yes,
with many of your close relatives, you spoke Russian, so I think that's
that is correct.
Also interesting. So,
Yeah, I did grow up in a family where my parents speak Russian as their native language, but say my mother comes from a Russian-speaking family, but my dad comes from Ukrainian-speaking family.
Yeah.
And that happened because Soviet Union, like Russian Empire before, it enforced this idea that Russian is the main upper-class language, and Ukrainian, or take it Lithuanian, take it Kazakh, any like local regional language, was a language of the peasants and non-educated people. So basically, if you had to study in university, you had to move to the city, you wanted to get a good job, all of that required to be speaking Russian, and also identifying more like, I am the citizen of the empire, I'm a Soviet citizen, I'm probably connected to my ethnic roots, but more like there is once a year, there's festival, and I dress up in this funny ethnic dress, but not much else was allowed in terms of showing your ethnic identity. Even if you look at like old Soviet posters, you would see that they like to represent all different republics as like people dressed up in their national costumes, but somehow the guy representing Russia was always wearing a suit. And it's like,
Okay.
I'm the white person here, and all of you guys are just like natives.
Okay.
We,
Interesting.
kind of conquered. So like there was this like clear kind of understanding in society that you have to speak Russian. So my dad basically, because he was born in the city to parents who came from villages, so for him was like, oh yeah, I'm a city person, I have to speak Russian basically. But then when I was born several years before the breakup of the Soviet Union, I grew up going to the Ukrainian school and just not having this understanding that Russian is somehow superior. And eventually it just clicked, and I remember I was at work and I was like, well, I don't want to read anything in Russian anymore, and started reading things mostly in English and Ukrainian. And step by step, I think over the course of maybe 10 years, I just completely switched to Ukrainian, to the point where that switch happened now about 10 years ago. And today, if I try to speak Russian, which I don't really do that often because luckily I don't have a need. When I try to speak it, I struggle because I keep remembering Ukrainian words, for example, or English words, but it's like I would start speaking and I would say some word in a different language. I'm like, oh yeah, that's not a Russian word. So like somehow if you don't use a language, even your native language, it will go away. So that's another thing with like, I think it is possible to learn Finnish as an adult. I think it is possible to unlearn any language as an adult too.
So these days you are speaking mostly or only Ukrainian with your family? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
I speak Ukrainian. I mean, everybody in my family understands Ukrainian. Even my grandma, who was born in Siberia, even though she's not totally Russian, she's Buryat, that is a subgroup of Mongolians. But yeah, she's speaking Russian as her native language, but she can understand Ukrainian because she lived in Ukraine for many decades.
Yeah, there's this idea going around in the web that Russian speakers are oppressed in Ukraine. Is that true?
I would say it depends on how you define oppression, right? If some group of people were feeling they were some sort of upper class and they were dominating the rest, and then this privilege is taken away from them, they will feel oppressed, right? I mean, slave owners will feel oppressed if slaves are taken away from them. And they will say, well, I didn't want this to happen.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think the way they feel is they feel that something is happening and they don't like whatever is happening, and they define this as being oppressed, even though that's not how I would define it. But also, in my experience, it was not Russian speakers, but it was Ukrainian speakers who were oppressed, because I remember in many circumstances, in many situations in Kyiv, it was weird when you start speaking in Ukrainian to somebody and they're like, oh, you don't have to try, like, let's just switch to Russian. Or like, oh, Russian is like the cool language, the default language. The language where like we are still like on the post-Soviet, territory, we are still speaking it. That was different depending on the city, of course. You go to Lviv, to the Western Ukraine, and there are people who would frown at you for speaking Russian, because they still have this memory of this being occupation, right? Because that part of Ukraine, it reunited with the rest of Ukraine later. So it had some period of time being part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, not Russian Empire. So there was not as much language oppression, especially from Russian speakers.
And there was a genocide
Yes,
in
of course.
Ukraine.
Yeah, there was also genocide which affected on the rest of Ukraine, and that definitely affected mostly rural population, so people in villages who were the main population who would speak Ukrainian, because like people in cities were speaking, a lot of them were speaking Russian even in the 19th century, because that was the policy of the Russian Empire, which was banning publishing books in Ukrainian, banning people studying in Ukrainian. Everything had to be in Russian, even in the 19th century.
And now we have this full-scale war between Ukraine and Russia. And some people are saying that well, peace is better than war, so we should like make compromises and with Putin, and we'll just give these areas, some southern Ukraine, eastern Ukraine to Russia, and then we will have peace. Do you think? What do you say to this thought?
Well, first of all, I think I know where it is coming from, because if you see and observe some violence or suffering on the TV, in the news, whatever, you just want it to end. You want just to push this magic button and say, I just don't want this violence to happen. I don't want those people to die. They're fighting on both sides. They're just each other. How about we end it? Whatever, like a bad peace is better than, good war, or whatever the saying is said. The thing is, genocide is also war, right? And so if you allow Russia to keep the occupied territories, first of all, you are subjecting all the people on occupied territories to genocide. Who, the way empires work, or specifically Russian Empire, is they go, they invade, they take some territory, and they try to assimilate as many people into becoming the citizen of the empire, or the Soviet person, or whatever. And those who refuse to do that, they're either killed or jailed or enslaved, whatever. They just been removed from the society in some certain way.
Or forced to
leave.
To the army.
Or to the army, or forced to leave the country. There is anyways, yeah. And so the end result of this peace is that people still are dying, suffering, people being raped, people's houses are being looted. Everything still happens, but it happens within this black box of empire, which can now control the information coming in and coming out. And so you just don't know it. You don't see it in the news. You don't know what's happening. It's just maybe 50 years later, somebody will say, well, there was actually a genocide and 5 million people died, but nobody knew about it because it was behind the curtains. So I guess emotionally people don't want to see suffering, and if it just disappears from the screens, they will say, oh, it's so nice, there is no suffering anymore. Or like even if it's there, I still don't hear it because I don't see it. But I think if you really care about there being no suffering, about ending the war, then you have to think about, well, will just stopping it right now work? Who can stop the war? Ukraine cannot stop it. The only way Ukraine can stop the war is by defeating Russia. Russia can stop the war any single moment. If today Russia decides we don't want this war to happen, they can just withdraw from Ukraine, go away. The war is over, because Ukraine has no idea, it has no plans to invade Russian territory. It never had those plans. It never had any plans to invade anybody. It doesn't have the empire, the mind of an empire. It doesn't have this idea that it should invade anyone. And to your point that there is a lot of Russian speakers. A lot of people in the Ukrainian army are speaking Russian. They are fighting Russians. The fact that somebody is a Russian speaker doesn't mean that they want to be invaded. They don't want to become part of Russia. They don't want their family to be killed or tortured. I think it's pretty obvious.
Many of them like democracy.
Exactly. They want free country. They don't want authoritarian dictatorship also. Because what Russia does, it invades some territory and then conscripts people on this territory to invade further. A lot of people who are invading Ukraine right now are from Chechnya, for example. Chechnya was defeated in the Second Chechen War. People from Chechnya being conscripted, sent to the war in Ukraine. What will happen if Ukraine gets defeated? Ukrainian people will be conscripted, sent to invade Poland, Lithuania, or maybe even Finland. We don't know. Whatever Russia decides to invade next, Kazakhstan. So it's a choice between fighting with the Ukrainians against Russia or fighting against Russians and Ukrainians together. And of course, if Ukrainians feel betrayed, then there will be more people kind of willing to take Russian side, because they will say, well, we tried to be with Europe, but Europe didn't want us, so we will feel, kind of revengeful in a way.
Do you think there's a possibility that if you kind of make a compromise with Putin, Putin's Russia will attack again in a few years?
That is very likely. That's what Ukraine is expecting to happen if this kind of thing will proceed, because that's what happened to Chechnya. The first Chechen war, Chechnya won. The second Chechen war, it lost it. Why? Because, well, it stood no chance against Russia. That took several years to prepare and actually invade fully and properly. The same will happen again if Ukraine signs some kind of a peace deal. It will have to become either heavily militarized, which is very difficult to do, being just a much smaller country, right? Russia is like, second biggest army in the world. Or it will have to join NATO or some military alliance, which is not NATO, but has the same level of protections, where there is a few big nuclear powers behind Ukraine that can help it to defend against Russia in the second war, which would be expected to happen several years later.
Russia invaded Ukraine already 2014?
Yeah, 10 years ago.
In eastern Ukraine and Crimea, so you can kind of see the pattern that
yes,
Russia took a couple of chunks from of Ukraine, and I was also kind of hoping that, okay, yeah, I guess Putin is, or part of me was thinking, okay, maybe Putin is a reasonable guy, he likes to look the tough guy, so he got his Crimea, he'll probably be happy. Maybe we could end on a cheerful or nice note. I was thinking if you could mention some beautiful things about both Ukrainian culture and Russian culture.
That would be a difficult thing to do for me in terms of like combining those two, because I feel like
it could be separate things, but
absolutely. I think I would start with Ukrainian, because that is the culture I'm identifying with, and I definitely think there is a lot of beautiful things about. I think just being very welcoming country in general. I think a lot of foreigners that came to visit in Ukraine, or just they came to visit Ukraine, they were surprised to find that foreigners in general are liked by Ukrainians, because Ukrainians want to be open to the world and want to learn more about languages and want to communicate with people outside, and just being nice to people is also cool in Ukraine. And I think one of the things that is very distinct between Ukrainian and Russian culture is that Ukrainian culture, it somehow constantly had to fight against organized governments. So anti-government sentiment is very strong in Ukraine. Ukraine is kind of, I would say, libertarian, borderline anarchist. People really have this instinct to self-organize horizontally. Like whenever something happens, people just find each other. Hey, let's do this. Let's do it. You bring food. You set up this tent. You make those guns. Whatever is needed in this situation, we just like self-organize and just do the thing, and then just dissipate, which is really beneficial, because for Russia it proves difficult to like find any like centers. They keep looking for a center to destroy, but there is just no center to start with. It's a distributed culture. And Russia is very hierarchical. It's like we have a Tsar, and everybody is under the Tsar, and like this is a strong like pyramid of power. So I think I really like and appreciate this part of Ukrainian culture, which is horizontal networking. Speaking of Russian culture, like of course I associate Russia with the enemy, with somebody who is destroying my country right now, somebody who I cannot associate any good things with. But I would say that there have been quite a few people who understood the evilness of the empire. They understood how Russia was mistreating other people, how they kind of managed to escape this bubble of empire mind, as I call it. And I don't know, they wrote books, they made some movies, they were like, hey, look at us, this is who we are. And I think just this part of Russian culture that kind of is very marginal, it's very tiny, but where people are trying to say, hey, look at like what we are doing, I think that always been the part that I actually would look at. I'm like, and it would be interesting to even read that or see those movies or whatever, because I think that would provide much deeper look and insight into how their society functions, what they're thinking about. You know, it's kind of a mirror, and I think I'm really thankful for those people for actually bringing this mirror, because I think without those people, it would have been much more difficult to understand the motivation behind their actions, understand what they're going to do next, and so on.
Mm. Yeah, I guess I could add that like talking with Russian people here who are living in Finland, who have seen different countries, unlike most Russians. Majority of Russians have never been abroad, and many of the Russians here who live here understand that there's just so much propaganda and lies in the television, and